Okay, so this chapter is chapter 2. It is over evolutionary psych. We'll talk a little bit about genes, reproduction, things of this nature. It is kind of like a preamble to child psychology, and so we'll get more into what you may probably think of as child psych here in the next chapter or two. The learning goals for this chapter are discuss what evolutionary psych is from like a child development perspective, describe what genes are and how they influence child's development, talk a little bit about reproductive challenges and choices, and explain some of the ways that heredity and the environment interact so that nature and nurture, the combination of those two things. All right, on the evolutionary perspective, before we get into that a little bit, genetically identical twins who are separated as infants so sometimes show striking similarities in their tastes and habits and choices. The book talks a little bit about this at the beginning of chapter 2. You've probably heard anecdotes like this before too. There's actually a film called Three Identical Strangers. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to watch it, but it goes in depth into how similar they are. Like they like the same kind of cigarettes, the same kind of cars, all these different things that they had in common, even though they had been separated at birth. And there was 3 of them, so just having twins, it was 3. There's also the Minnesota study on twins reared apart, so you might get some information from there too. Can we conclude that genes caused these similarities in their tastes, their choices? There are other possibilities that probably need to be considered. For instance, the twins, or in the case of that one movie, the triplets, they spent some time together, maybe even for several months before they were separated. They could have been adopted by similar families, and so they were exposed to similar environments. And so there's several things that could have went into working into shaping them in their choices. And it may seem like that they are, what you're possibly seeing there is a coincidence, and we are perceiving them as correlations because that's how the human mind works, is we like to see patterns. And so we're going to see a lot of similarities between these twins, but we're not going to notice the differences as much. So yes, they may have been in similar homes. Some of them may have been coincidental similarities. There's probably a lot of things that they don't share. There's a pretty striking example of this in the Three Identical Strangers. Once they get a little bit further into the story, there was one that turned out significantly different than the other, but I don't want to spoil it for the people that may want to go watch it. Okay, so to start off in this chapter, evolutionary psych, start off with Darwin, obviously. We'll talk a little bit about natural selection and adaptive behaviors. Natural selection is the evolutionary process by which individuals of a species that are best adapted are the ones that survive and reproduce. So Darwin, he talked about this in On the Origin of Species. It was written in 1859. One thing he says is that all organisms must adapt to a particular place, their climates, their food source, the way of life to be adaptive. And adaptive behavior is a behavior that promotes an organism's survival in its natural habitat. One of the examples from the book is the idea that between a caregiver and a baby, there's an attachment there. And so that attachment is an adaptive behavior for both the infant and for the parent that is trying to produce and offspring. It ensures that attachment. It ensures that the infant's closeness to the caregiver, so they get feeding, they get protection, and it leads to better changes of survival for the baby. And consequently, the parent is able to pass their genes on. On evolutionary psych, it emphasizes the importance of adaptation, adaptive behaviors, reproduction, and what they call the survival of the fittest in shaping behavior. Fit, in this sense, refers to the ability to bear offspring that survive long enough to bear offspring of their own. So essentially that you would have grandkids, that they go on to produce their own offspring. There's a pretty famous evolutionary psychologist named David Buss. He reasons that evolutionary psych is persuasive, and it's a major part of our lives, and it influences how we make decisions, how aggressive we are, our fears, our mating patterns. It's a part of basically every part of our lives. Buss has some really interesting work, and I do suggest that maybe you go check a little bit of it out. Personally, I'm not a fan of all of it, but there is some that he makes a compelling case for some of his arguments. As an example, perhaps men have better spatial skills because it was adaptive, because it helped them become good hunters. So let's go back to hunters and gatherers times for a second. And let's say the men are the ones that are going out and doing the hunting while the women are staying home and taking care of the offspring. Maybe that didn't happen in some cultures, but in a lot of cultures, maybe it did happen. So the men are going out to do the hunt, and they need good spatial skills to go out and find, where are the animals at? How do we get back home? And the men that are able to go out and be successful in hunting, they're able to bring back more food, they're able to have more offspring, and consequently, they are more adaptive in this environment. And so this is a very interesting theory, and it's very possibly true. But one of the issues with evolutionary psych research is that you can't test that exact hypothesis in a highly controlled environment. So you can make experiments that are kind of similar, that hit upon similar notes is what we're talking about there, but you can't go back to hunter-gatherer times and run experiments with those, obviously. Related, there are some evolutionary development psychologies, two ideas to consider as well. Humans take a very long time to develop compared to other animals. So we have an image here on figure 1. An extended childhood period might have evolved because humans require time to develop a large brain to learn the complexities of human society. And so here's this image that kind of describes that a little bit. One of the parts of evolutionary psych is that the mind is not this general purpose device. They have what they call domain-specific modules. And so there might be a module that's for physical knowledge, for tracking animals, like in the example before. One for mathematical knowledge for trading, and one for language. So there's all these different specific modules in the brain for these different things that humans do. Related to this, evolved mechanisms are not always adaptive in contemporary society. And there are several examples of this. One very well-known one is the idea that humans' propensity to gorge on food when it's available. So when food's available back in the hunter-gatherer times, you might not get to eat every day. It might be every other day, every third day. So you're going to want to eat as much as you can to store up that fat so that you have it to run off of. Today, though, in today's society, we get to eat. A lot of us, most of us, eat 3 times a day. So it's not an adaptive behavior anymore to gorge ourselves on food all the time, but a lot of people do. On evaluating evolutionary psych, it is one theoretical approach among many. Like we had talked about in the last chapter, the idea of the eclectic approach. You want to take bits and pieces from all the different theories. So Bandura, he rejected evolutionary psych because he saw it as like a one-sided evolutionism, is how he worded it. That he sees that they tried to take all social behaviors and make it a product of evolved biology. And so in his mind, it's not all evolved biology. Some of it is distinct for humans, and it has grown out of our social behaviors that are not necessarily based in evolution. Somewhat related to this is the idea that evolution, it gives us biological potentials, but it does not dictate our behavior. And I can see this. As an example, IQ. When you are born with your genes, there's probably a range for where your IQ is going to end up. So let's say your range by your genes is like 115 to 140. And then what happens as you grow up and you're with you're in your environment, you're with your parents, you're with your schools, you're in your neighborhood, you're going to zero in on what that range is. So if your range was 115 to 140, you have great schools, great parents, all those things, you'll end up closer to the 140 as an IQ. However, let's say you have bad schools, your parents are neglectful, things of this nature, you might end up closer to that 115. So your genes are not dictating what your IQ is going to be, but it does probably set a range for it. And I can get behind that idea. That does make sense to me. All right, on the next slides, we will briefly discuss some genetic foundations of development and reproductive challenges.